You have questions? We have answers. Welcome to the Therapist Question Box with your host, Miss Lindsay Schiss.
Welcome back to another episode of the Therapist Question Box. I'm your host, Lindsay Schiss, and today we are continuing our two-part series around boundaries with Micah Ingalls. Micah, thanks for joining us again.
It's great to be back.
We are just going to continue because we felt like there was so much information that we wanted to share that we didn't want to cut it short. So if you haven't listened to episode 1, go back and listen to that, and then you will be more up to speed on what we're talking about now. So we'll go ahead and review the listener's question, and then we'll pick up where we left off. So the listener's question is, can you share some examples of healthy boundaries that can be set in relationships and how we can approach our friends if we feel those boundaries are being crossed? So Micah, let's just start right in with the process of boundaries. So we talked a little bit before about understanding our values and how our values really affects our understanding of our boundaries, right?
Absolutely.
So Tell me, is that the whole process of boundaries, or is that just the beginning?
That's just the beginning.
Okay.
Right? And then to get into the process of boundaries, we need to understand that there are internal boundaries which define how we relate with ourselves, and external boundaries which define how we are going to relate with the world around us.
Okay. Can you give us an example of an internal boundary?
Yeah, an internal boundary I kind of tried to describe in the first episode, but how I'm going to relate with myself in response to different situations. I'm going to choose kindness in response to a child as opposed to choosing anger. And if I'm choosing anger, then I need to step away. And that's how I relate with myself. I choose kindness.
Okay, so this is who I want to be as a person, basically.
Yeah.
Like this is how I want to show up in the world. This is who I am as a person.
Correct.
And these are my boundaries to help me show up in that way.
Yep. To help me show up that way. Whereas external boundaries are more how I relate with others.
Okay.
It's still about self and honoring your values, right? But then it's this external relationship with others or things, right?
So give me an example of that.
Yeah. An example would be, I don't, little self-disclosure, don't use my phone after 10 p.m., right?
Nice.
Because I know that affects my sleep, and I value my sleep. When I don't get good sleep, I'm not a kind person. So externally, I set this boundary with this external object and say, I don't use my phone after 10 p.m.
By the way, congratulations on that.
Oh, I'm not great at it.
No, I think that's amazing. And I think we all could do better at that. So do you put your phone away from the bed in order to honor that boundary? I mean, is there a way that helps you honor that boundary?
Yeah, so then we set this physical boundary, right? This is an example of plugging my phone into charge. It's my alarm clock, but I plug it into charge over by the dresser, right?
So then you can't just reach it and grab it whenever you need it or you think you need it, right?
Correct.
Good. I love that. So internal boundaries and external boundaries. We need to differentiate those two things.
Yep. Again, how we relate with the world around us, external, how we relate with ourselves, internal.
Good. Okay, so values first, internal boundaries, external boundaries. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about actually the process of doing these boundaries and incorporating them into our lives, right? So let's see, can we talk about some examples? In this question, she talks about, well, we don't know if it's a she or a he, but they talk about boundaries in friendships. So can you discuss that? Like, are boundaries going to be different depending on the relationships? We talked a little bit about that in the previous episode. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, boundaries are there to protect our values and define where we begin and end. And so depending on how much trust there is in a relationship, how much safety there is in a relationship, that will impact where the boundaries are or what boundaries we set, right? If it's a friendship and there's trust there, excellent. Then there's maybe fewer boundaries, but there's still always going to be boundaries.
Okay.
Even in a deep, connected, committed, trusted marriage or romantic relationship, you're always going to have personal boundaries.
And do you think you need to describe those boundaries or let the other person know what your boundaries are?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes. Right. I think we want clarity for especially those external boundaries. Some of the internal boundaries, maybe not.
Yeah.
Right. I can have an internal boundary of, if a friend says something rude about a different friend of ours, internally my boundary is I just don't respond to that. Right. And that's my internal response to it.
Yes.
If it continues, and I value not talking poorly about others, I may need to speak up and say, hey, you know what? I actually don't like to talk about people that way. That's not my approach to life. And so when you talk about things that way, I feel uncomfortable or I don't appreciate it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the internal boundaries are probably just kept to self, and some of the external boundaries we can share, and it may be helpful, right?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So with friends and romantic partners, I would imagine those boundaries are going to be pretty different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For good reason, right?
Right.
So understanding that, there are times where we are with a friend where maybe we didn't know we needed a boundary, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, wait a minute, this felt uncomfortable. I need to set a boundary. What do you do in that moment? Is that in the moment of it being uncomfortable? Are we making that boundary? Are we telling the friend? How do you suggest we handle that? Because that's usually how we know there's something off. We need a boundary set.
And that's where I would encourage you to do what you need to do to get through that immediate moment, but then step away and tune in, process, figure out which of your values was feeling threatened in that moment.
Okay.
And what does it need in order to be honored?
Yeah.
Right?
It's interesting you say that, because I had a situation a couple of years ago, and it was, I kept bumping up against it with a friend, and I kept feeling like, I just want this person to change. I don't want them to keep acting this way. It really bothers me. It makes me so uncomfortable. And for a long time, I just sat in frustration about it until I realized it was actually me who needed to have a boundary. I needed to have a boundary with this person, and I needed to honor myself more. And it was so interesting, because when I realized it was actually me, I was the problem. I needed to change some things because I was uncomfortable with this behavior. But it wasn't my job to change this person's behavior. It was my job to change my interaction with the behavior. And it's amazing, because I'm not kidding you, Micah, and by the way, I'm a therapist and I do this work, right?
Right.
I spent a long time trying to get this person to change and trying to figure out ways. And really, what I needed to do was change. And when I decided my interaction was going to change with this person, it completely changed how I felt about them. And I was honoring myself and I was honoring them, and I wasn't resentful anymore. And I was able to actually feel closer to them because I was honoring a boundary. And it was so interesting, because again, it's like I can teach this stuff, but actually doing it sometimes in our own life is harder, right? It's when the rubber hits the road, it's harder to actually implement. And so that was a real reminder to me that I needed to actually do some boundary work myself. And it wasn't about, here's the boundary I'm going to give to you. No, it's about self, right?
That's exactly right. Lindsay, there's so much wisdom in what you shared there. That's a great example. It's about self and honoring our boundaries for self. And that might mean we change the interaction we have with others, but we can see how easily boundaries can turn into control and manipulation.
Yes.
Right? Subtly, you were trying to manipulate their behavior.
100% I was. And the interesting thing, Micah, is I wasn't even trying. Like, manipulation, when you hear that, you think, oh,
it's
that was
a big
like
word.
nasty,
I know,
right?
sorry.
No, but actually the truth is I was.
Yeah.
But I didn't even realize it until I had to take a step back and say, wait a minute, it's not my job to control this person. They get to show up exactly how they want to, but I get to decide how I'm going to engage with them. So
yeah, and that's part of boundaries. It's not our job to control them. It's not our job to manage their feelings, to manage their behaviors. And those are other indicators that we need a boundary when we are trying to manage others' feelings, behaviors, etc.
That's when we know.
That's another indicator. Yeah.
I want to repeat that when we're trying to control another person's behaviors, then we need a boundary.
Yeah.
Good. That's so helpful. So any other thoughts on examples of boundaries with friends versus partners, or dating relationships, maybe coworkers?
Yeah, good question. Let's start with a dating relationship, because that's kind of this transition process from friendship into committed partnership. In a dating relationship, for example, let's say you go on a first date and there's not much safety yet, and so we put boundaries in place to create safety and trust. Those boundaries can be physical boundaries, they can be space boundaries, time boundaries, and we establish those initial boundaries because we value our safety, or maybe we value our perspectives and our opinions. And so on this first date with someone, they're critical of an opinion or a perspective we share. And it's like, okay, I'm going to start by just noticing, okay? And I might set an internal boundary. If they continue to be critical of me, then I'm not going to engage in future interactions with them. And maybe that criticism continues throughout the date. And you might say, okay, I'm actually going to add to that boundary in this moment, and I'm going to end the date early because they're not honoring my values, right? And I can communicate, and we may have a second or a third boundary in there. Hey, it seems like you're being critical of my boundary or of my values here. So, if you really want to get to know me, and that's what the purpose of this date is, I'm going to invite you to get to know my opinions, get to know who I am and not be critical of them. And if they continue to be critical, then, right, we can end the date and move on. Find someone who values you for you.
So I hear you say that, and I think that's awesome. And that would take a lot of courage.
It would.
Why is it so hard to say those things?
Again, it goes back to yourself and your personality, but saying no is hard.
Yeah.
Right? Feeling these societal norms that we can't end a date early if it's not going well. Why? Where does that pressure come from in life? Right?
Is it because we just want to be loved, we want to be needed, we want to be liked? And so because of that drive is so strong in us that we sometimes don't honor ourselves in the process.
And that's how boundaries can protect us from those relationships of not being liked. By saying no up front, you are showing yourself that you love yourself, that you accept yourself. And if others don't, you're not going to enable them to stay in your life.
That is a beautiful thought, that you love yourself enough that you honor yourself first. Yeah. And that relationship with self matters the most. And then we honor others too, right? It's not to say, again, we're in this cancel culture, we're not interested, but we're saying, no, I'm honoring myself. And so here's my request. Here's what I'm going to ask, right? Do you think it's fine to request when it comes to boundaries to say, this is what works for me? Is that going to work for you?
That's totally fine to communicate that, as long as it's not about trying to control their behavior. It's about self, right?
How do you know when you cross that line?
That's a good question. How do you know that?
Yeah, because that feels like kind of a shaky line of like, here's my request. I'm not trying to control you, but I'm also trying to honor my own self in this.
So to me, it would look something like stating what the value is. I want to have a friendship with you. And I know for myself, it's important that my opinions and perspectives are valued. Right? If we're going to have a friendship, I need to have those be valued in this friendship. Otherwise, I am not going to be able to have that connection with you that I want to have.
So good. And again, courage. I mean, as you say that, I think that takes courage to be able to say what you need and ask for that. And then the courage to be able to walk away.
Right.
If it is not right for you and it is not honoring your values, the ability to walk away. So as we're talking about that, why do we struggle to keep our boundaries?
That's a great question as well, right? I mean, when we struggle to keep our boundaries, to me, it's information that there's probably more self-work we need to do, right? I struggle to keep my boundaries personally when I'm worried about letting someone down. And so if I'm struggling to keep a boundary, it's information of, who am I worried about letting down here? And what is that about for me? So it's really valuable feedback for us if we have identified our values, if we've established some internal boundaries, some external boundaries, and we've communicated them to ourselves or to others, and we're not keeping those. That's really valuable for us to learn about self and say, okay, there's a part of me, there's a wound within me, there's a concern I have that's getting in the way of me keeping my boundaries. Let me go do some work on that.
And as I hear you say that, I think, gosh, and to address that with some compassion.
Yes.
Because, as you were talking, I thought, boy, we all have wounds that have not been addressed. And sometimes we have wounds that we don't even know are there until somebody pokes on it. And then we go, ooh, that hurt. That felt uncomfortable. And to be compassionate with ourselves around those wounds, right? Sometimes I think we go, why can't I do this? It's ridiculous. I should. But to actually take a step back and go, wait a minute, this might be a wound. And there's some pain there that probably needs to be addressed. And that's okay.
And it leads us to our values.
Yes.
I don't like letting people down. And if I'm compassionate with that and I learn about that, it's because I want people to feel cared for. I want them to be seen. I want them to know that their needs matter. And then I need that boundary there and it's not my job to fix that, manage that, be responsible for that on their behalf.
And wow, isn't that freeing?
Yeah.
That's not my job. I don't have to do that.
I can show up in a way where I see them, where I value them.
Yeah.
But to make them feel that, to make them experience that isn't my job.
Okay.
And that is freeing.
Yeah. So freeing. So as we're talking about boundaries, the listener asked a specific question about what can we do if we feel our boundaries are being crossed, right? So we've talked about how difficult it is to keep our own boundaries, but what if we feel our boundaries are being crossed? What do you suggest to this listener?
I would suggest that they slow down and tune in and say, okay, I'm feeling energy, or I'm getting feedback that my boundaries are being crossed, right? Do you know what that boundary is? Do you know what value or values that it's protecting? Okay? And if it's being crossed and you know what the boundary is, then we can create a boundary chain where we have that first boundary of, if this, then I will respond with this, right? And then the second step is, if you continue to cross that boundary, then I will respond by doing this. And then a third one, if this, then this. And that's where we don't want to jump straight to canceling people or cutting them out of our lives. But for this listener, let's say hypothetically, the boundary that's being crossed is, over, I don't know, what might it be? What do we think?
Gosh, it could be anything. I mean, we could make up maybe this boundary is that maybe this friend, that this person values trust in a relationship, and this friend maybe isn't trustworthy.
Okay, there you go. Right. So this individual values trust, and the friend maybe isn't trustworthy and has shared confidential information with others, right? So then if I value trust, right, then really what we're saying is we value safety. I value safety. Then I'm going to have an internal boundary of, I'm not going to share as much with this individual. Right?
Yes.
And if what I still share with the individual is still being spread to others, then I'm going to need to step away from that relationship.
Or step back from the relationship.
Step back.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Step back, and then we'll see where things are at, right? And if eventually you need to step away, that makes sense. Yeah.
And we could even have another boundary in there of, if I learn that this friend is sharing information, then I will talk with the friend.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, safety and trust are really important to me.
Yes.
Right? And I feel less safe when I learn that you're sharing things I've shared with you with others.
I really appreciate understanding that, because I think sometimes we think a boundary is unkind. But the reality is, Brene Brown says the most compassionate people are the most boundaried. Mm-hmm. And as you're saying this, I think because that friend actually knows where you stand. That friend knows who you are and what matters to you and what doesn't. You're not going behind their back, and you're not feeling resentful and hateful. You're actually just saying, this is what works for me and what doesn't. And you get really clear about that, right?
Yeah.
So again, quoting Brene Brown, one of the things she says is BIG, which is, what boundaries need to be in place to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumption about you. Like, that feels like a really great way to live. Like, if I can have boundaries, then I can make generous assumptions about you, because I'm standing in my integrity. I'm honoring myself, right? So I love that idea that when we are boundaried, it's actually the most generous thing we can do, versus the opposite. Again, I think sometimes we think, oh, it's not kind to be boundaried. The truth is, it actually is really compassionate.
It's really kind and compassionate to yourself and to the other people in your life.
Yes, it makes perfect sense, right? So is there anything else, Micah, that I didn't ask you around boundaries that you feel like would be important to share with our listeners?
No, I don't think so. We're just hitting on this idea that you can set boundaries, and it gives you increased personal empowerment to set those boundaries. And you can show up more as your authentic, generous and have that self-integrity, right? And it strengthens connection, right? We don't want to use boundaries only to cut people out. I think boundaries can create greater connection with people.
Yes, so important. That boundaries are not about keeping people out.
Yeah.
They're more about making space for healthier relationships with self and others, right? So Micah, just to recap, I really appreciated understanding the process of boundaries, that we need to get clear about our values first, right? Understanding what matters to us first. Is there any ideas that you can point our listeners to do some values work, to explore their values?
I mean, listening to your body. It's going to give you that feedback of when your values are not being honored, but then taking time to look at the things that give you vibrance, give you energy in life, the things that you feel joy and enthusiasm towards. Those are going to help you understand what you value. Good. What's most important to you. Yeah,
things that you're passionate about. Yeah. Those are really clear values of yours. If they really matter to you, you're usually pretty passionate about it, right? What give you life and vibrancy. I love that idea. Understanding also that boundaries are different in different relationships, right? Partners versus friends versus coworkers, and getting really clear about that. I loved the idea of what to do when a boundary isn't respected, right? Yeah. That we get to say, okay, we get to set it out for the person, and then we get to decide how we're going to show up in the relationship and what we're going to do. Not go straight to canceling, but decide what we will and won't share, or how we're going to show up in that relationship and how we're going to change so we can live in our values and honor our boundaries.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And the last one is, how to help us when we struggle keeping our boundaries, and to look at that with some mindful self-compassion, recognizing there might be wounds or some history there. And also that there may be times where we have a boundary that is violated that, wow, we didn't even know it was a boundary till it's violated.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So to give ourselves some permission to have compassion for ourselves around that. right? And to understand that, again, boundaries are not about pushing people away. They're more about, I think about it like this. Boundaries are like living in a house. If we didn't have boundaries, it's like living in a house without walls. It's unsafe and unsustainable. We actually need to have boundaries because they keep us protected.
And we got a great example of that with everyone working from home during the pandemic. We lost a lot of boundaries within the home, right? The walls of the home define the different roles in the home, right? We've got a bedroom, a living room, kitchen, office, but all of a sudden, right, work was brought home, and I've seen a lot of couples actually struggle with that loss of boundaries in the home.
Yes.
Right? Loss of work and home boundaries. And so if you are working from home, great, keep doing it, but learn how to define those boundaries so that it's not a boundaryless space.
Yes. I love that. Where work ends and when it begins, where home life begins and where it ends. Even in the pandemic where we were in the same physical space, we had to have boundaries around our time and our energy and how we were utilizing that.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Micah, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in today. Exploring the importance of setting and keeping boundaries is such an important part of our relationships. And I really hope that this episode or these 2 episodes have inspired our listeners to be more deliberate about their boundaries and to recognize that they are something that is not only healthy for self, but healthy in their relationships. If you enjoyed this episode, we hope that you will listen next time and share it with those around you. Until next time, take care.